everyone, in this video I'm going to be walking you through a possible solution for question 1 in the practice activities for chapter 5, section 3, which is on resolving many-to-many relationships. So we'll just get started by reading the instructions for this question. It says, resolve the many-to-many relationship between teacher and class, as well as interpreter and language. For each intersection entity, think of additional attributes like a UID. So they've given us two many-to-many relationship diagrams. Now, these are separate, so this is actually a two-part question, and we're going to start by working with the teacher to class many-to-many relationship, and I've already copied both of these into Lucidchart so that we can use them as a reference. So we'll just jump right in with this first many-to-many relationship. So this diagram is about a teacher observing a class and a class being observed by a teacher. So the first thing we need to do is create the intersection entity for these two entities. Now, for this one, it might make sense that a class isn't observed every week, maybe every other week, and so there may need to be a schedule so that you know when each class is being observed and by who. So we will call our intersection entity observation schedule. Now we're supposed to think of some attributes that this intersection entity could have. A really easy one in this case would be maybe an optional attribute for remarks. So things that the teacher had to say about the class. Now, everything in this observation schedule is going to kind of have something to do with both of these entities because it's just a chain link that links them together. And it helps us so that we don't have this many-to-many relationship anymore. So we will move these entities down here. Maybe. I want it to be perfectly in the center because that's who I am as a person. There we go. So we'll start on the teacher side of this relationship diagram, and we will start by figuring out the optionality lines. Now, this many-to-many relationship diagram does give us some information to start with. In this diagram, the teacher may observe a class, and that's going to be the same situation down here. So we're going to start with a dashed line down here, because a teacher may be on the observation schedule, but if they have extra planning to do one week, or if they're sick, they may not necessarily be on the observation schedule for that week. So a teacher may be on the observation schedule. On the observation schedule side, if there's a class on this observation schedule, then there has to be a teacher to observe and make these remarks. So, a solid line, because there's no wiggle room. If there's a class on the schedule, there needs to be a teacher to observe it. So now for the cardinality of this side. The observation schedule must be for a teacher. Well, if there's a class to be observed, and you need a teacher to observe it, you don't need more than one teacher to observe this class. So the observation schedule must be for one and only one teacher. Going from teacher to observation schedule, a teacher may be on the observation schedule for a class. Well, if we have more classes than we do teachers, some teachers may have to observe more than one class that week. So each teacher may be on one or more observation schedules. So we need to put our crow's foot on here. And now for the UID of this intersection entity. Because it's an intersection entity, its UID is going to be a combination of the teacher UID and the class UID. And so we don't want to write those UIDs on the ERD more than once. So in order to get around that, we use a bar to mark that the observation schedule is gaining a UID from teacher. So that is the first side of this diagram. Now we'll move to the class side. So on the same token, this many-to-many diagram does give us the information that class starts with the may optionality, and that's going to be the same down here. A class may be on the observation schedule. Again, if they observe classes every other week, the class may not be on the observation schedule for that week. So we're going to use our dashed line. I'm not sure why this is happening. There we go. And so we'll use our dashed line. There's some wiggle room for circumstances where they may not be on the schedule. Going from observation schedule to class, if there's a teacher scheduled to do an observation, they need a class to observe. So the observation schedule must have a class associated with it. There we go. No wiggle room here. So now for the cardinality. Well, if there's a teacher on this observation schedule to observe a class, we don't need a teacher to observe more than one class at a time because that's pretty much impossible. You can't be in two places at once. So this observation schedule is going to stay. Each observation schedule must be for one and only one class. Going from the class side, a class may be on the observation schedule, and if they're being observed on a, twice a month basis, the class doesn't need to be on the observation schedule twice in the same week. So this is going to stay as class. Each class may be on the observation schedule once and only once. So that is our cardinality for this side. Now, again, observation schedule is gaining a UID from the class entity because its UID will be a combination of the teacher UID and the class UID. So we do need to put that bar on here. So we'll go in here. It's at the very bottom. And add our bar. And this is your finished ERD for part 1 of question 1, minus the transition statements. You can write those in, whatever makes sense to you for those. If you need to, pause the video, take some notes, and now we're going to move on to the second part of this question, the interpreter language many-to-many relationship. So, again, we start by creating the intersection entity down here. So I've got a box for it. Now, this diagram is about an interpreter speaking a language and a language being spoken by an interpreter. Well, if we run an interpretation agency, it may make sense that we need to know the skill level of the interpreter for a particular language. So we will make our intersection entity translation skill. Now for an attribute that we could put on here, fluency is pretty important. We need to know if they can fluently speak French, Spanish, whatever language it is that their specialty is. So we will put fluency as an optional attribute. So again, we're going to put our little friends down here, our entities. Wow. Forgot what I was doing there for a second. Okay. So there we have our two diagrams. We're going to start on the interpreter side. Now again, this many-to-many relationship diagram does give us a little bit of starting information. In this diagram, the interpreter may speak a language, and that's going to be the same down here. The interpreter may have a translation skill in a particular language, but they may not. If our agency offers translators or interpreters who can speak French, Spanish, Russian, German, all those, it's not realistic to think that every single interpreter is going to know all of those languages. So the interpreter may have translation skills. So we're going to use a dashed line for this one, because there's some wiggle room for instances where they may not know every language. Now, going from translation skill to interpreter, if there's a language listed with translation skill, then we need to know what interpreter has that translation skill for that language. So this is a must optionality. So we're going to use a solid line because we have to know which interpreter has that skill. Now, for the cardinality, going from translation skill to interpreter, if there's a translation skill listed for a language, it's not realistic to think that that's going to be the same translation skill for that language for every single interpreter in our database. Because we may have one interpreter with a translation skill in French that is an expert, but we may have a whole bunch of people who are only beginners at translating that language. So this is going to be translation skill must be for one and only one interpreter. Now going from interpreter to translation skill, the interpreter may have a translation skill. And if we offer multiple languages at our interpreter agency, this interpreter may know how to speak more than one language. They may speak French and German. So they may have one or more translation skills in the languages. So we're going to use a crow's foot. And again, with our UID for this intersection entity, we need to signify that it's gaining UID from interpreter and language by putting a bar on both of these lines. So I've put a crow's foot with a bar. So this side of our ERD is done. So now we're going to move to the language side over here. So our many-to-many diagram up here does give us a starting point. This language may have a translation skill associated it with an interpreter, but not everybody speaks the same every language in this agency, so we may not have an interpreter for that language at this time, or a certain interpreter may not have any skill in this language. So a language may have a translation skill for an interpreter, but it may not. So we have some wiggle room, some dashes, some space in between for other circumstances. Now going from translation skill to language, if there's an interpreter listed with translation skill, then we need to know what language that translation skill is for. So we use our solid line because we need to know that. There's no other way. We have to know what language this translation skill is for. So now for the cardinality. Now, going from translation skill to language. If there's an interpreter with translation skill in a given language, it's not going to be you're not going to have more than one skill level for each language for one interpreter. So we're going to have, for each translation skill, there must be one and only one language, because this interpreter is not going to have the same skill level in every language, and you're not going to have multiple skill levels in the same language, most likely. So this is going to be a one and only one on this side. Now going from language to translation skill, a language may have a translation skill, may not. If you think about it, when you're looking at this diagram, you kind of read it all together. They all tie together. The language may have a translation skill for a particular interpreter, because this is just a chain link. It connects the two. Well, this interpreter may know more than one language. There may be multiple interpreters that know this language. This may be German, and we may have 4 interpreters that know this language. So the language may have one or more translation skills for interpreters, because we may have more than one interpreter who speaks that language, and we may have someone who's a beginner, someone who's an expert, someone who's intermediate at it. We could have one or more skill levels for each language, depending on how many interpreters we have. And again, we're putting this bar on here to signify that translation skill entity is gaining UID from interpreter and language. So here is your final UID ERD for the second part of question 1. If you need to, pause the video, take some notes. I hope that this video was helpful to you. Have a magnificent rest of your day, evening, study session, whatever time it is. I hope it's going great for you. Thank you.